life is full of distractions and interruptions. There are things that distract us, that kind of get us off pace, and they're going to happen. For 8 weeks, we talked about Nehemiah, and we saw different distractions that Nehemiah experienced. The enemies were coming against him, and sometimes they were trying to distract him with things that didn't seem bad, but the distraction itself was bad. The distraction to get off of the path that God had set him on was bad. And we have distractions and we have interruptions, but what's important is that we realize the difference between the two. What is a distraction and what is an interruption? What is a distraction from the enemy and what is a divine interruption from God? And that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to spend most of the time talking about interruptions, but I want you to know the difference between a distraction and an interruption. So a distraction is something that makes it difficult for you to think or pay attention. A distraction is something that makes it difficult for you to think or pay attention. The distraction can oftentimes, if I'm working on something, the distraction can come in the form of an email or a text message. I'll get that notification, and that's a distraction. And what it does is it pulls me off of what I'm doing, and I follow a rabbit trail. One time it was kind of humorous that I got an email, and I clicked over on it, and it was something about having ADHD and getting distracted. And I'm like, yes, I'm getting distracted by reading this email. And so what I did, instead of going back to my work, I went to social media and put a post about it. So, it was distractions. They happen and make it difficult to think or pay attention. But an interruption is a hiatus. It's an intermission. An interruption may frustrate you, but it's not the end. It's something that interrupts the path that you're taking. And in my 21 years of full-time ministry, I have experienced distractions and interruptions. And as a child of God, it's important for us to know the difference between a distraction and an interruption. And when the enemy is trying to distract us and when God is interrupting what we're doing to get our attention. There's been times when the distractions have come into my life with opportunity. Sometimes it comes in the form of something that may not be bad, but it's not God's plan for my life. And when you're distracted with opportunity, you see that, again, I'm just kind of glancing back. I'm not talking about Nehemiah. I'm not in the book of Nehemiah this morning. But we saw a bunch of distractions in Nehemiah over that period of time. We saw how they were trying to distract him away from the work. They were trying to lead him out into the plains of Ono to have an opportunity to distract him from the work. And he didn't fall for it. Also, another way that I've experienced distraction is criticism from opposition. Nehemiah was in the same thing. He had these two or three, Sanballat, Tobiah, and then Geshem the Arab came in and was also part of the opposition to detour. I talked a few weeks ago about when you are distracted and you take a wrong turn somewhere and it leads you on a road and then you're lost. You don't know where you are. And I compared it to, driving in Winter Haven and how, sometimes you can just get turned around, or at least I could back in when I was learning to drive. Another one is fear, and we don't like to talk about fear a whole lot because, we don't like to admit that we have it, but fear causes you to worry about something that might happen or cause you to worry about others and what's going on with them, and that ends up distracting you from what God is speaking or leading you down the path. And when you are distracted by the enemy, that's the goal. That's the point. The enemy wants to take you. It may not be to turn you 180 degrees away from God's plan. It may be just to begin to veer you off a little bit and distract you so that over time you don't even realize how far you strayed from the direction that God has for you. But that's when interruptions come. That's when God steps in, interruptions happen. So all that to say, that's kind of led me to make an announcement. And after much consideration and prayer, this is a test. This is a test of the emergency broadcast system. This is only a test. I hate that thing. I hope that nobody's pacemaker went off. There's probably some people who were watching online and they heard that noise and they grabbed their phone. Is that an Amber Alert? No. That was done on purpose. That was an interruption. That was done because that's what happens. Right in the middle of something that at times we're really interested in, right in the middle of what's going on, God will drop an interruption into what we have going on to get your attention, to tell you what it is that's going on. Maybe it's to wake you up that you've been driving the wrong path, or maybe it's, I was actually driving yesterday, and I went to visit my grandmother who's in failing health. She's 91 years old, and I want to spend some time with her. So on the way home, man, I was tired, and I was, had to shake myself awake, because if not, I was going to veer into the wrong direction, which would have been very, very bad for everybody else. But there's times when God will do this. Something will happen, and He will wake you up in your emotions, in your spirit, whatever it is, to get your attention. And He'll interrupt your regularly scheduled program. And oftentimes it's like that. It's just for a test. This is just a test. This is just to make sure that you've got everything in order. But we don't like interruptions because they mess up our plans. Hi, I'm Rodney, and I like to be in control. And I know there are others that would join along with me in saying that. Maybe you're not as much as me. Maybe that's not as big a deal to you. But you are enjoying being in control. If you didn't like to be in control, there's some that maybe you control isn't for you. But I'll say this: as far as our lives' direction are going, nobody wants to feel like it's careening out of control and it's off the rails. But I like to be in control. I like to plan things out with no delays and no interruptions. But interruptions remind me that I'm not in complete control of my life. I think sometimes I'm in control, but the divine interruptions remind me that ultimately it's not me that's in control of my life. I like to think that for the most part, I'm in control at church too. But the reality is that this church doesn't belong to me, and it doesn't belong to you. It's His church. In the book of Acts, it says that He added to the church daily those who were being saved. What a great way to end that story of the early church. People were added to every day, those who were being saved. But it was God that was doing it. It's not my church at all. God grants me decision-making authority. He allows us to work together to move His agenda forward. But He'll often interrupt that to remind us that He's the one that's directing things. He'll wake us up sometimes and say, hey, guess what? Hey, you were going on the right path there. I got you started, and you're veering off just a little bit. Let's get back on track. Psalm 37:23, the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, and He delights in His way. Good man. Also, other translations say righteous. And He delights in His way. So one of the things that I love about that is that it says that God takes pleasure in orchestrating the moves in the life of His people. He likes when He does what He does, and He orders our steps. He loves it when you're able to put your life in His hands, and He begins to direct your steps for those that are righteous, ordered by the Lord, and He delights by that. He delights in that. And God honors and pre-organization and planning, and he honors that. And there's proof of that in the Scriptures, even in parables, especially when it comes to the return of Christ. The parable of the wise and the foolish virgins. You have those that were ready, those that had their lamps trimmed and burning, and they were ready for the bridegroom's return. And then you had others that at the last minute, they were, oh no, we've got to get ready. And while they were running around getting ready, the bridegroom came and they were left behind. So especially when it comes to the return of Jesus, He is very much in favor of us being prepared. We need to have things in order and make sure that we are prepared. But don't think for a second that He doesn't have the right to interrupt your agenda and your plan any moment that He wants. He is sovereign. God is sovereign. He's God. And that's one of the words. Sovereignty isn't a specifically biblical concept. It exists outside of theology. But I want you, when it comes to God, I want you to understand what it means when we say that God is sovereign. Sovereign means He'll do whatever He wants to do, whenever He wants to do it. God is sovereign. He will do whatever he wants to do, whenever he wants to do it. And it's like he said to Job, were you there when I hung the moon and stars? I mean, Job went through it. Job was someone who didn't do anything wrong to deserve what had happened. The enemy went to, the devil went to God and said, let me attack one of your people. And he's like, consider my servant Job. And he's like, I'll never be able to because you've got your hand on him. He's like, okay, you can take away his stuff. Like, well, I'll never be able to. He'll never curse you. He'll never do that because he's going to stay healthy. Okay, you can even touch his health, but you can't kill him. And so Job went through it. He lost everything. His wife told him to curse God and die. His friends, for chapters upon chapters, we see his friends or his advisors that are sitting there telling him, man, you did something wrong. There's something not right about you because nobody is supposed to go through this. And while Job never sinned and cursed God during that time, some of that did get to him. And when he and God have a conversation in the latter part of the book, God's like, look, you're questioning me. And he corrects him lovingly when he asks him things like, were you there when I flung the stars, when I hung the Pleiades? Were you there when I put the moon and the stars in the sky? When I began to create, where were you? He's God. All by himself, he's God. And he doesn't need our permission to interrupt our lives because he can direct your life so much better than you can. Again, Psalm 33 here, verse 10, the Lord brings the counsel of the nations to nothing. He makes the plans of the peoples to no effect. Man, if we've ever needed a verse in Psalm to speak over government systems, this is it. The Lord brings the counsel of the nations to nothing. He makes the plans of the peoples to no effect. So when we see things on the news or we read things on the internet or in a newspaper or wherever, and we get discouraged, we get worried, we get distracted, here is an interruption to bring us back on path. The Lord brings the counsel of the nations to nothing. He'll do what he wants to do whenever he wants to do it. And it reminds us that, makes the plans of the peoples of no effect. That reminds us that sometimes God is going to come in and get involved and frustrate even our own plans. But I'm not like them. I'm not bad like, no. He will frustrate the plans of the peoples as well. Sometimes the reason our plans change is because God is getting involved. Because if our plans go through, it'll mess up our lives. About a year ago, I preached on that, about thanking God for the unanswered prayers. And how if it were just up to me, how my life would be completely different than it looks now, because I had about 12 or 13 different plans for my life before God brought certain people and certain situations in there. I mentioned first service, there was about 6 different girls that I was planning on marrying before I even met Lindsay. And I would have if those girls would have married me. But no, God had a plan for my life. I had a plan, and if it would have played out the way I wanted it to, I would not be in the situation that I'm in now, inside God's will. But I have to trust that when he interrupts, when he changes my direction of what's going on, it's because he has the plan for me. God is not so concerned about how these interruptions will affect my schedule, even if my life is full of doing his work. It's that he wants his will for my life, not my will. So if God begins to interrupt you and you're like, well, hold on, God, you can't get involved here. I'm involved in ministry. I'm doing this, and this is for you. So I need you to back off so I can bless you. No. God will often get involved and sometimes in the middle of something that we would see as good and as working towards him if he wants us if he wants to interrupt us in order to make sure that we are doing his will for our lives. His interruptions come into my life to bring about his will for me. His interruptions will come into your life to bring about his will for you. So how do we tell the difference between the enemy's distractions and God's interruptions? How do we know if something is a distraction or an interruption? Well, I don't know. This sure does seem like, here's this thing. Is it a distraction? Maybe. Is it an interruption? Maybe. How do I know? Well, I'm about to show you. We're going to look at a few of these, and we're going to compare them back and forth. The first one is this. Satan's schemes will always try to alter God's plan and purpose for your life. If it's a distraction from the enemy, it will be to lead you away from God. The enemy is not going to lead you towards God. Satan does not want you to seek more of God. He wants you to think that you can do it on your own. He wants you to think that, okay, God gave you the tools and you just kind of go out there and do your thing. God's not going to mess with you. You just go do your thing. And when we get out there on our own and we stop seeking God, even if it's something that we do within the church, or it's something that we do that is good, or something that is ministry, if we are doing it outside of seeking God's will and His purpose, we will begin to do things on our own. When we do things on our own and we take God out of it, we're open, we're vulnerable to distractions. We're vulnerable for being led in the wrong direction. And ultimately, we'll end up giving up on it. There'd be too many times, well, every time I try this, I fail. Every time I do this thing, it just doesn't work. And so I'm just not even going to try anymore. The other side of that is that divine interruptions cause you to pause and reevaluate your calling. All right, I'm bebopping along, having me a good old day. Something happens in my path. Is it a distraction or is it an interruption? All right, okay, this thing is now leading me away from God's calling in my life. It's leading me away from God. That's a distraction. I'm bebopping around the next day. I'm just going about my life. Something else is in my path. Okay, what is this? This is an interruption because it's causing me to stop and reevaluate my calling. It's causing me to stop and say, wait a minute. When God interrupts our lives, maybe it's just that He's giving us a moment to take a step back and check where we are. Some of the most life-giving moments that God has ever given me have been during interruptions to what I was doing on my own, both in my personal life and in my ministry. It's in these moments that God shows up and tells me to get my hands off of it for a season and let Him be in control. No. I've got this, God. I've got this. I know. I'm laser focused. For those who have been through Dave Ramsey stuff, I have gazelle intensity. I am going after this, and we get so focused that we miss the bigger picture and what God's wanting to show us, and it causes us to take a step back and say, God, you know what? You're right. Look, hey, by the way, awesome thing to say. Get used to it. God, you're right. Because that's always the right thing to say. God, you're right. You're God, I'm not. And I never want to be God. I will willingly admit that even in times when I like to be in control and I want to see things the way that I envision them, I don't ever want to be God. Yet my actions will cut Him out of it if I don't seek His will. The same thing is true for many of you. I don't think that if I ask any of you, do you want to be God? Nobody would want to take on who God is. Not just like God's responsibilities, like, when He wakes up in the morning, He's got to do this. No. Just the entire person of God, and no, nobody wants that. However, our lives say that when we get to going and, okay, God, I've got this, it's like a kid learning how to ride a bike. Let go, Daddy, I've got it. Ugh! But we don't stop at a bicycle. After we've learned to ride a bicycle, eventually we get old enough and we drive a car. And then after that, we some people, I got my CDL, and I learned to drive buses and all the things that go along with that. So there's different things along the way where no matter what it is in our natural life, our spiritual life, whatever's going on, God will be right there with us. And when we try to take it for ourselves, especially if we stop pursuing His will, we will eventually fail. So God will interrupt us, and He'll show us, and He'll say, time for you to let go and let me take care of this. The next thing, a distraction will cause you not to think clearly, but a divine interruption will give you a chance to gain perspective. I'm being distracted by this over here, and I don't know where either of it's going. I don't know if this interruption, I don't know what's on the other side of this interruption. I know that distraction is cloudy. And it's never played out better than in Acts chapter 9, when we see the Apostle Paul, but before he was Paul. he was a man named Saul from Tarsus. He had a life before Christ. Many of you can talk about what your life was before Christ and how your life was in a certain direction and how you had experienced difficult things. I've heard some of your testimonies of where your life was going. Richie is one that has told his testimony, and he's testified of the goodness of God, that after Christ was involved in his life and it changed the direction because he was on a downward spiral. There are many of you in the same way. You can understand what the Apostle Paul went through during his conversion because you identify with this experience. But here is this experience in Acts chapter 9, beginning in verse 1. Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if he found any who were of the way, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. He's asking here, so men and women of the way, that was another way of calling them Christians. They weren't called Christians until a certain point, so they didn't really have a name for them. They were just men of the way. And so if they were believers in Jesus, you see, Saul believed that he was on a mission from God. He believed that he was doing the right thing in how he was persecuting them. He went and got permission to bring them bound to Jerusalem. Verse 3, as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light shone around him from heaven. Then he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, who are you, Lord? Then the Lord said, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. It is hard for you to kick against the goads. So he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what do you want me to do? The Lord said to him, arise and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. He said, arise and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. What's cool about this here is that we don't see the calling on his life yet. All we see is that God has interrupted what he was doing. He interrupted him being on his way to persecute, to drag Christians back to Jerusalem, to be put on trial, to be executed, whatever. He was there, had his purpose in mind, and God interrupted it. Jesus showed up to him on that road, but he didn't tell him what plans he had for him. He'll actually tell somebody else in just a minute. Verse 7, and the men who journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice but seeing no one. Then Saul arose from the ground, and when his eyes were opened, he saw no one. But they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And he was 3 days without sight, neither ate nor drank. Here's Saul, this man who was a leader. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was blameless when it came to the law. He was the one who spoke, and people did what he said. And now, because his life was interrupted with an encounter with Jesus, the people who he used to direct now had to lead him. He was doing this all in the name of God. You see, in his mind, he was ridding the world of false teaching. He didn't believe in the deity of Jesus. He did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. He was living his life as if the disciples were the ones that were the heretics. The disciples were no longer following Yahweh, God. They were the Yahweh, the God of Israel. He would never send someone like this Jesus guy who's overturning our entire way of structure. There's no way that. And because he believed that, he believed a lie, and because he was deceived and he believed a lie, he based his entire life's plan on fulfilling something, and Jesus interrupted him on that road. Saul considered Jesus as a false prophet, and it had to end. He was leading people astray with his false doctrine. Many times we're on a path that we think is right, but all of a sudden, the interruption happens. When Jesus steps in, when the light shines, when we're knocked to the ground, when we no longer can see as clearly as we once saw because of this interruption, It's oftentimes because Jesus is showing up to let you know. You may think you're on the right path. You may think what you're doing is for God. You may think what you're doing is the best thing for you or for your family, but I'm going to show you here with this interruption how it's not. And Saul was stricken with blindness. And that's a struggle for many people because they want God to make things more clear. I want it clearer. I don't want to be more cloudy. I want to know what happens 6 weeks down the road. But things will become more cloudy during these situations. And there's been moments in my life when I didn't know what was next and I didn't know what to do. The future was cloudy, and I'm not a big fan of that. God, no, what do I got to do for you to clear that up? And for Saul, it was, you got to stop persecuting my people. You got to stop persecuting Jesus. Saul, why do you persecute me? Is what Jesus said to him. So he was put in darkness. Anybody afraid of the dark? Or you got kids that were afraid of the dark? As believers in Jesus, we cannot be afraid of the dark. And I'm not talking about being afraid with the lights off. We have to learn that during the moments when we can't see what's ahead of us, God will send someone to take us by the hand, just like he did with Saul. And you know what happened? I said it just a minute ago. He was then being led by the people who he used to lead. He relied on them to take him to this place where he was instructed to go. God sent people to take Saul and lead him, and he will send someone in your life to lead you until you can see clearly again. Don't be afraid of the dark. When you reach that time, you trust God more in those moments than ever before. That's why sometimes he'll send the darkness. You may be in that time right now where you can't see. You could see it earlier, but you're just not sure what's next, what lies ahead. You're learning to trust God more than you ever have. And what happens? The steps of a righteous man, the steps of the good, are ordered by God. And a good righteous there, I don't mean just, oh, he's a good person. No, right living, righteousness. The steps of the righteous are ordered by God, and he delights in his way. He delights in when we fulfill the direction that he is, when we go in the direction he sends us, when we fulfill his will. Verse 10. Now there was a certain disciple at Damascus named Ananias, and to him the Lord said in a vision, Ananias? And he said, Here I am, Lord. So the Lord said to him, Arise and go to the street called Straight, and inquire at the house of Judas for one called Saul of Tarsus. For behold, he is praying. Verse 12, in a vision he has seen a man named Ananias coming in and putting his hand on him, so that he might receive his sight. Then Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much harm he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. And here he has authority from chief priests to bind all who call on your name. So Ananias is like, okay, all right, so this is good. The Lord is speaking to me in a vision, and he's saying, Ananias, I want you to go to a house on Straight Street. Oh, God's sending me somewhere awesome. This is it. This is it. This is going to be my fulfillment. I've been seeking God. There you're going to find a man named Saul of Tarsus. Oh, wait, God. There's more than one Ananias in Jerusalem, right? Or in Damascus, or in just wherever the region. They were in Damascus. But there's more than one Ananias around here, Maybe you meant to get that to another person, and he takes the Job route. Oh, God, surely you don't mean for me to go. Because don't you know about this guy? Don't you know what he's done to your people? He's got letters that give him permission to take us bound back to Jerusalem. And here we are. And what are you talking about here? Verse 15, but the Lord said to him, Go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel. For I will show him how many things he must suffer for my name's sake. Go. And here's where the calling comes. You see, the calling didn't get told to Saul. He had no idea at this point. All he knew was get up, and they're going to take you to somebody's house, and you're going to wait there, and I'm going to send someone to help. Okay. So he's blind, and he's waiting, but while he's waiting, God told somebody else his calling. And that's a beautiful calling. that he will bear my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel. That was a calling that would basically open the door for the gospel to go around the world. But that the other side of that was verse 16, I will show him how many things he must suffer for my name's sake. Paul would suffer. We'll talk about some of that. Verse 17, and Ananias went his way and entered the house, and laying his hands on him, he said, Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road as you came, has sent me, that you may receive your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. Immediately there fell from his eyes something like scales, and he received his sight at once, and he arose and was baptized. After this experience, when Paul received his sight, he never saw life the same way again. He never saw life the same. And that's the way it happens. When Jesus interrupts your life, if you are living in sin and you are waiting for a divine interruption to happen, I'm telling you, this is it right now. You hear my voice in this room. You hear me or you're watching online. This is your moment, your divine interruption in order for God to change what's going on. You're having an encounter. The Spirit draws us to Jesus. He draws us to the Father. We need forgiveness. And Saul was knocked down. He was blinded, and he went and stayed in someone's house for 3 days fasting and praying because he had an encounter with Jesus. And once he was able to see again, he never saw life the same again. Because once you encounter the Master like that, your world can never be the same. You can never see that again. You can never see life without knowing all that Jesus did for you, without experiencing, because you experienced him, you can see life with new and refreshed eyes, knowing that this interruption has changed your life. Saul of Tarsus became Paul the Apostle. And there would be many more interruptions that God would send his way. He tries to join the disciples in Jerusalem, and they're scared. They got the same thing as Ananias, and like, whoa, wait a minute. Yeah, God, not so sure about that guy. We know his reputation. We don't want him in here. But there was an interruption in their lives as well. Because God had chosen Paul to take the gospel, and he would plant churches, and he would grow disciples, and he would eventually have his day before Caesar. Here's another way to know whether it's a distraction or it's an interruption. A divine interruption will always benefit others and not just you. Paul's life was interrupted on the road to Damascus, and he went on to write the majority of the New Testament. These letters that he would write to churches, letters that he would write to different people, some as short as the letter of Philemon. You know, there's so many other things, some deep theological meat that he's delivering to the church at Corinth, or that he's sending to Romans, to the people of Rome. There's some deep theological stuff that is written in there. All of that because he had an interruption. In fact, some of you may have had your life interrupted by the writings of Paul. If you came to Christ because someone shared the gospel with you and they shared some of the passages out of Romans, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is life eternal. If anyone has shared that with you in a way to lead you to Christ, then the writings of Paul, the Spirit inspired him to write those letters. And that is eventually included in the what we have as known as the entire Bible. And we read that and we share that with people. And those scriptures are life-giving because they lead us to Christ. All of that because your interruption happened because Saul had an interruption and it changed him. He became known as Paul. There's a few other interruptions that I want to tell you about. Moses had a couple of major interruptions in his life, and it happened in 40-year increments. The first interruption, I'm sure he has no memory of. He was born, and Pharaoh was killing all of the Hebrew boys. His mother put him in a basket, set him in the Nile. He was found and taken to be raised in the palace with Pharaoh. But God ordained it and worked it out. His own mother became his nurse. So he was raised. He had to be raised in the palace so that he could get an audience with the Pharaoh years later when he would return. He had to be raised so he would understand the social and political structure of Egypt, so that when it was the right time, he could go and he could gain access and could do the things that were needed to be done. When he was 40, life was interrupted when God had to bring him out of Egypt and send him to the wilderness. It happened because he murdered someone, and he murdered an Egyptian that was beating a Hebrew slave, and he tried to hide it by burying him in the sand. And of course that didn't last. Once people found out about it, he had to flee. So that was an interruption. For 40 years, he learned how to live in the palace. He learned the politics. He learned the social structure. Then for 40 years, God was preparing him because he knew what was going to happen. The children of Israel would be led out of Egypt, and they would need a leader who knew how to survive in the wilderness, because there would be an additional 40 years that they would be wandering out there. But while he was out there tending sheep, he had another interruption in his life in the form of a burning bush. God got his attention and said, "It's time for you to go back. It's time that you put the past 40 years to work. It's time that you put the first 40 years to work." And these divine interruptions, all three of them, from him being in the basket, to him fleeing to the wilderness, to him returning after the burning bush moment, all of those divine interruptions happened so that God's people could be led out of slavery, so that they could be delivered, so that they could be free. Now, they made their own mistakes. They ended up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. But at that point, 40 more years, there was another divine interruption. And for Moses, it was the best interruption he ever had, to be taken to heaven. And Joshua took over and led the people into the promised land. Flash forward thousands upon thousands of years, and there was another young girl, a teenage girl who was just minding her own business, being a great girl, being a wonderful person. And I said thousands of years. It wasn't like it was 100,000 years later. But this young woman was just traveling along, and all of a sudden she receives a vision that she's going to become the mother of the Messiah. She is carrying a baby, and that baby would be the Son of God. 30 years after that, that woman would interrupt the life of that son at a wedding feast. And in that moment, the public ministry of Jesus begins. During that 3-year period of his public ministry, a man who loved his daughter, his life was interrupted when his daughter became ill. And so he had to find Jesus. So Jairus goes to Jesus. He tells him, and Jesus was teaching. He was interrupted by this man who needed his daughter to be healed. And so Jesus begins to travel to go heal this little girl. And while he's on his way to heal this little girl, what happens? Somebody else whose life had been interrupted is now interrupting. Are you starting to see that my interruption sometimes intersects with your interruption, and your interruption will overlap with somebody else's interruption, and they all converge at Jesus? The interruptions all trace back to Jesus, because it always comes back to him. And so what happens when Jesus is on his way to heal Jairus' daughter, this woman with the issue of blood, she just reaches out and touches the hem. Jesus, feeling the virtue having flowed from him, turns and says, "Who touched me? And your faith has made you whole." And in that moment, he heals this woman. There's this amazing moment of celebration. The people come up and they say, "You know what? Don't bother Jesus. She's already gone. Your daughter's already gone." Jesus was on his way to heal her, but he was interrupted, but the girl was dead. But guess what? Jesus interrupted death and brought that girl back to life. Why? Because every single one of these divine interruptions leads back to Jesus. All of these people were healed because of these interruptions. Interruptions will benefit someone besides you. Maybe the interruption that you have will come in the way that it has with me. Sometimes, in fact, this has happened so many times I don't even count. I just thank God. There have been times I've been delayed. Something interrupted me. Maybe I'm waiting on some kid to brush their hair, or I get stuck by a red light, or something else happens. I get a phone call, whatever it is. And then I'm headed somewhere. I get 15 minutes down the road, and there was an accident. And it times out just about it was likely that I would have been involved in that. One time I was riding down the road, and I remember this vividly because Lindsay was pregnant with one of our kids. In fact, it might have been our first one, Charlotte. We're riding down the road, and for whatever reason, I kind of slowed down. There was a truck up in front of us that was carrying big, like metal tanks of oxygen or helium, whatever, and it had the big metal cap that goes on top. One of those fell off of that truck, and I watched it roll around, and as I slowed down just a little bit, it went under the tire of another car, and it shot straight this way in front of me. If I had been driving like I normally would have been driving, that would have come in the passenger's window and would have killed my wife, pregnant with my oldest child. It was a divine interruption that caused me to slow down just long enough for my wife to live and birth 3 more children after that one and be the mother to our 5th, which was adopted, all because of that divine interruption. I am so grateful for divine interruptions when I know that they are and times when I'm not sure. Divine interruptions mature us because they cause us to think about others, not just ourselves. They make us realize that we're not in control of our own lives, but that our steps are ordered by the Lord. And what happens? He delights when we walk in the paths that He has laid out for us. Will you stand? God's trying to interrupt the lives of people in the room today. And if you're fighting it, if you want to be in control, then my encouragement for you this morning is just let go. This interruption is not just for you, but it's for the benefit of others. Somebody else's life is going to be made better because you allowed God to interrupt your regularly scheduled programming. Somebody else's life is going to be good because you allowed God to take control and the direction. And what happens? When you follow the steps that He orders, He delights in it. Others you may be fighting, whether you even know if it's a distraction or if it's an interruption. But God wants you to have clarity. He wants the scales to fall from your eyes, and He wants to give you perspective on what to do. As we begin to pray this morning, you can come down. I know we prayed for needs earlier, but if anybody else needs to, maybe you need to respond to the interruption of salvation. Jesus is appearing to you, and He's saying, why have you been rejecting me? Why have you been ignoring me? Maybe it's so far as to say, why have you been persecuting me, as He said to Saul? But if God can redeem someone whose purpose it was to bind and lead His people to their deaths, He can redeem you. No matter what mistake you've made, no matter what failure you're carrying around, let the divine interruption caused by the Spirit of God drawing you toward the Father, let that take control. Release control yourself and submit to His will. The steps of the righteous are ordered by God, and He delights in their way. Father, as we come into your presence to worship you through prayer,